When the young state of Western Australia first began stretching its limbs like an awakening giant, roads and railways were needed to serve settlers who had pushed out into the hitherto wilderness. With the pit sawing method of timber far behind, steam mills were being built to reap wealth from the state's natural timber resources. Men, skilled as both bushmen and axemen, were needed to supply the mills with raw materials. Others, employed either in gangs or as lone cutters, spent their days in the bush, hewing sleepers to satisfy a hungry rail-building program, both at home and abroad. Hand hewing flourished until about 1939, when the method gave way to mill-sawn sleepers. Today, sleepers are still in demand, but the supply is met by modern electric-powered mills, like this one at Yarloop, Western Australia. Walking through some jarrah bush today, one may find rotting tree stumps and billets showing where a cutter once plied his trade. Mostly these have been burnt or blackened by forest fires. To find how the man who cut these sleepers worked and lived in the bush, let us turn back the clock 50, 60 years or more. In those days, a cutter could be selective in his choice of tree, settling for one he thought easy to fall and split. While he may appear to cut at random, his knowledge and skill help him to scarf the tree in a manner that will cause it to fall later in exactly the spot he requires. The bark of a jarrah tree is very stringy and, unless removed, can cause a saw to jam in the wood. The unskilled would recoil at the thought of using a cross-cut saw like this as a solo effort. The lone cutter is a man of great ingenuity, and he has devised a method he calls the groper stick to keep the unmanned end of the saw swinging easily, in perfect rhythm. Rhythmic working and breathing over the years has attuned his system to the point where working seems effortless. The proud tree has been humbled, but the victor welcomes a few moments before his next chore. Today a new camp must be built, but first his simple belongings are shifted from the old campsite. Although unproductive, time spent erecting a new camp nearer to the bush he is working outweighs time lost walking back and forth to a distant camp. Living in an age before a ban on the picking of wildflowers, he feels that these will add a homely touch to his new camp, and besides, they would only be destroyed as he clears away debris to make the camp site. His skill with the axe and fallen saplings provide forked sticks and poles for firstly his fireplace, and later the frame of his tent. A canvas provides one cover, bark from the already fallen tree is an ideal natural material with which to build a shelter around the camp galley. The wide sheets will give protection from wind and rain. Nature and his own imagination provide a stand for his wash basin. He greets each new day with a campfire. It provides warmth when cold, hot meals and companionship. A refreshing wash to start the day and while the breakfast of kangaroo steak sizzles and the billy boils, he makes up his bed. A simple one from forked sticks, poles and hessian. Out here, he is his own butcher and baker, his simple bread being a damper made from flour, water and salt. Mixed and placed in a camp oven, it will have ample time to cook in the ashes from the breakfast fire. Washing dirty dishes is a practical measure to help keep away bush flies. The blackened billy has become a symbol of the Australian bush, and outback man would as soon venture to work without it as he would without his tools. The cutter has left some of his tools along the track, and all must be gathered for the next stage. While the billy requires little or no maintenance, the tools do. He keeps the axes razor sharp with a file or stone. The cross-cut saw requires a more complicated and skilled approach, and for this he uses firstly a gauge to check the rake of the saw teeth, and later a file to sharpen them. If the saw does not cut easily, he can only blame himself. Sometimes difficulty in sawing is caused by a log pinching the saw, and he corrects this by hammering in a steel wedge. Now rolled into a suitable position, he marks out the billet with hammer and wedge and sets about splitting in half. But the log is reluctant to yield its inner secrets. The outer wood of the billet is cut away with the narrow axe. His skill is put to the test as he uses the broad axe. The cutter is left-handed and uses an axe designed for the left-handed man. For the right-handed, a special handle would be fitted at the opposite head of the broad axe blade. A vicious instrument, the broad axe could easily slice through a man's boot and foot. In order to collect some compensation, one cutter was said to have deliberately cut off his toes. An insurance investigator found his right foot was injured, whereas the left boot had been cut. Needless to say, the victim lost toes, insurance, and a good pair of boots. However, only a brave man would cut himself on purpose and painfully hobble miles in search of aid. Paper-fine shavings coming from the axe indicate one side is almost complete. Dampened cord rubbed into blackened bark is a perfect marker. Though blackened and rough, his hands make no mistake as he measures and marks out for the next stage of the sleeper. He has a standard to maintain, and both measurements and cutting must be exact. Today, the sleeper carter will arrive. Above the sound of the ring of his axe, the cutter hears a distant cooee. The reply will guide the carter, who is approaching along a nearby bush track. While the cutter mops the sweat from his brow, the dray rumbles nearer. The sleeper tipped aside, and the cutter goes to meet his old friend, and the only other human with whom he will have had contact in several weeks. The horses have travelled a long way. Only when they have each been given a nosebag of chaff and oats will the carter share a billy of tea and some food with the cutter. The cutter is anxious to hear news of the world beyond the Jarrah forest in which he lives and works. There is no radio in his day, and no telephone in his world of bush and wild animals. Now the welcome break must end. For the carter there are sleepers both here and at other log sites to be loaded. On this occasion he is assisted in the loading by the cutter. Soon they must go their separate ways. The carter to complete his load and return to the railhead where the sleepers will be checked by an officer of the forestry department. If up to the required standard, they will be passed, and the cutter can eventually get his payment. If not up to standard, they will be rejected. A cutter with too many rejections can become a bad credit risk of the store where he obtains his simple needs. An unknown author, speaking of an equally unknown cutter, wrote, "He could tell a curly jarrah from a jarrah on the wind, but he couldn't tell his tucker bill was 20 quid behind." The cutter relies on the position of the sun in the heavens by which to tell the time. A quick check reminds him it is time to make his weary way homewards. After a long day's toil, his back is bent and his step is slow. He's gladdened to find the damper is cooked to perfection in his absence. Can he spare the time to sample a slice before preparing the simple evening meal? Soon will come the darkness, and with the darkness will come the end of another day, and the end of another era. The era of the men whose skill provided hundreds of thousands of hand-hewn sleepers. Though the hand-hewn sleeper is finished, the fame of its undoubted superiority still lives on in Western Australia.